welcome everyone. Welcome here. Welcome also to our listeners and viewers that are online. This year, Story Art Center has taken a different approach to Black History Month. Instead of having a single speaker on campus to mark the occasion, we've planned a series of events spread throughout the month of February. Today is the first of this program, and we are drawing from the talents right here on campus. Dr. Jesse Feyen is one of our own. He is founder, coordinator, and professor of the Music Industry Arts and Performance Program. As a multi-instrumentalist and vocalist, he has performed internationally in a wide range of genre and context. Dr. Feyen holds a PhD in ethnomusicology from York University. His doctoral dissertation is a groundbreaking work on the Black Canadian gospel music here in Ontario, and we are privileged today to learn more of its historic and cultural importance. Please help me welcome Dr. Jesse Feyen.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. I think maybe I'll just use this mic stand and I'll back up a little bit if that's okay. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming, and I'm truly excited today to share a little bit of my doctoral research with you. Now, initially, it may seem that the Black Canadian Church and its music might seem like sort of a niche special interest topic to be talking about for Black History Month. But I think you'll find today that the Black Church in Ontario is actually a tremendously important institution historically, and the Black gospel music that it fostered has contributed in valuable ways to Canadian culture and has had an international impact. And so I'm hoping to cover a lot of ground in the next little while. I'm going to give a little bit of historical background. I'll go into the Black Church, and then I'll go into some Black gospel that was made in Ontario. We'll hear some recordings. We'll watch a video. So I want to begin by saying that the earliest Black Canadian churches in Ontario were formed by escaped slaves. And it's a part of Black history that usually comes after the end of stories that we typically hear about Black slavery. And I think you've heard these stories before, that Africans were kidnapped from Africa and forced into slavery in the United States and in other places. And it was a terrible situation. And in an attempt to improve their situation, some were able to escape slavery, fleeing north, some through a secret system called the Underground Railroad, and they came into Canada, where they found freedom, period. And that's usually where the story ends. But I would say that that's just where the story is beginning, because what did they do when they arrived? They started new lives. They started families. They found work. They established communities. And one of the most important things they did to start a better life in this country was to form churches. And in order to fully understand how African American slaves started escaping to Canada to find freedom, we need to talk about this man. This is John Graves Simcoe. He was the first lieutenant governor of Upper Canada, which is modern-day Ontario. It used to be called Upper Canada. And he hated slavery, and he wanted it abolished immediately. So that's right, slavery used to exist in this country too. The trouble was, several members of his legislature were slave owners, and there were a lot of others living in Upper Canada who owned slaves and would have been really upset if slavery was abolished immediately. And so he was forced to compromise. And the compromise was something called the Act Against Slavery in 1793. And its goal was to abolish slavery gradually. And there are a number of ways that it did this. And one of the ways it did this was that there was a law that any slaves entering Upper Canada would become free upon arrival. So this was, of course, as you can imagine, very significant to African Americans, and many of them found out about this law during the War of 1812. A number of African Americans fought on the British side during the War of 1812. Doing so, they felt would sort of improve their situation, and they found out that, gee, if we cross the border into Canada, we become free. And so it's after the War of 1812 that we start seeing waves of migrants, African American slaves, coming and finding freedom in Canada. And I want to bring up a map here to show you some of where these early black settlements in Ontario were. And you can probably tell by looking at all of the blue markers that there were two different ways that African American slaves escaped and entered Ontario. One way was over here on the left. The word Detroit is kind of covered up by these blue markers, but they would enter through Detroit, Michigan, and arrive in Windsor, or the Windsor area. And you can see there was a number of settlements around there, and some went further inland and settled in the Chatham-Kent area. There was an early black settlement called Buxton, another one in Dresden. And the other place where they came in was through Niagara Falls, New York. And they settled by Fort Erie, which is just on the other side of Buffalo, or Niagara Falls, Ontario. Some went a little further inland, settled into St. Catharines. A number of escaped slaves were worried about being recaptured, and so they went further away from the border and settled in places like London, Brantford, Hamilton, Toronto, some even up as far north as Collingwood, and even there's a small town called Oro, where that was an important early black settlement, and that's a whole story for another time, but I just wanted to give you a bit of an overview. And in all of these places, churches were established, and they were important, of course, for religious reasons, but the Black Canadian Church was the community hub for Black Canadians. It was the one place where Black Canadians could meet as a community for any reason without the influence of the predominant white culture. That was the one place that they had. It was the one place where blacks could exercise leadership and control over their own lives, their own destiny, and their own community. The Black church also ran something called Sunday school. Some of you might, when you hear the word Sunday school, you might picture young children learning about Bible stories. In the Black church at this time, it was much more than that. It was a place for young and old to come. All ages would come, and they learned how to read and write. The Black church was heavily involved in literacy. They realized that an important part of establishing a new and better life for themselves and their children here in Ontario was literacy. And the Black church was responsible for teaching literacy to the Black community. The other reason it was very important was that newly arrived fugitive slaves were integrated into the Black community through the Black church. Picture it for a minute. A newly arrived fugitive slave would probably arrive and would be exhausted and hungry, and his clothes would be in tatters, and he might need medical attention. He would have nowhere to live, no job, not really much of a plan, and the first thing he would do was come to the Black church, where he was welcomed with open arms and integrated into the community, into the Black community. They would help him and support him. This was important, obviously, for the newly arrived individual, but it was also important for the entire Black community, because if there was anyone among them who was seen as being a burden to society or needy, that would have fueled the negative stereotypes of Black Canadians that already existed in the minds of white Canadians at that time. So in order to fight those negative stereotypes, the Black community did everything they could to make sure that no one was in need, no one was a burden on society, and so they looked after each other. And all of that happened through the Black church. And I want to point out a couple Black churches that are particularly important today. Here's a picture of Toronto First Baptist Church. This is the building as it exists today. It's on Huron Street, not far from Kensington Market. But the original structure of this building was where St. Michael's Hospital is today. It was established in 1826 by fugitive slaves. And it's significant because this was the very first Black church in Toronto of any kind. The very first Baptist church in Toronto was formed not by whites, but by fugitive slaves. It was also the first Black institution of any kind established in Toronto. 1826, almost 200 years ago. quite amazing, and it still exists today. Here's another important church. This is Salem Chapel in St. Catharines. This is the modern-day structure, and this church is famously associated with Harriet Tubman. Many of you may have heard that name before, Harriet Tubman. She is the most famous figure associated with the Underground Railroad. She helped many slaves escape up through the Underground Railroad, and she was a member of Salem Chapel. So any slaves that she helped escape, she would bring them to Salem Chapel. This, for them, was the final stop of the Underground Railroad. This is where they found freedom. This is where they started a new and better life here in Upper Canada. And you might be able to see on this picture that there's a garden, a small garden to the left of this church, and that's devoted to Harriet Tubman. There's some historic plaques there too, all about Harriet Tubman. That's how closely she is associated with Salem Chapel. Now, in all of these churches, whether they were larger, more well-to-do churches, or whether they were tiny rural churches with, in a fallen-down building in the middle of the wilderness, there was a wide range of different black churches that existed. And no matter what, we know that music was a crucial part of it. And it was a vibrant music community because we know that they made effort to sing out of hymnals. If they could afford an organ, they would get an organ installed. And one of the ways we know this is true is through these historic documents. These are the Amherstburg Baptist Association minutes. The Amherstburg Baptist Association was an association of black Baptist churches formed by escaped slaves, and the association dates back to 1841, and they kept handwritten minutes, and here they are. And when you open up these books and take a look inside, we have handwriting written by a fugitive slave dating all the way back to 1841. And they're useful for a lot of historical reasons, but there's also a lot of mention of music. We know that they were singing out of hymn books, that if churches could afford organs and pianos, they would buy them. There were choirs that were formed into the 20th century. We know there were soloists and there were orchestral instruments that were used in churches. And so music was definitely a really important part. And out of that vibrant music culture, there were a few groups and individuals that rose up and made music that traveled well outside of the black church. And the first group that I want to talk about is the Canadian Jubilee Singers. So this was an example of a Jubilee group. Many Jubilee groups existed, especially in the United States, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And basically what these groups were about, it consisted of black singers who were classically trained. They sang in a very refined, almost operatic sort of style. And these groups would perform African-American spirituals, songs like Down by the Riverside, Wade in the Water, Swing Low, Sweet Chariot. I was playing some of those songs earlier today. And they would present them using these sort of classical vocal arrangements in a vocal style, and would present them in a very formal way, and all of this really appealed to the predominant white culture. You can see here that they're dressed very formally. The men are all wearing tuxes, the women are all in formal gowns, and they performed for largely white audiences, and many groups were able to make quite a substantial living doing that, because it was a very popular concert format. And I just want to play you a little clip just so you get a sense of this style. This is not a clip of the Canadian Jubilee Singers. It's from another famous group called the Fisk Jubilee Singers. This was their earliest recording, dating back to 1909, so it's over 100 years old. It's not the best recording quality, but it'll give you an idea of what this sounded like. So very likely the Canadian Jubilee Singers sounded a lot like that. The Canadian Jubilee Singers were formed in Hamilton in 1879. They began their career by touring Britain from 1882 to 1887. They performed there for Queen Victoria on several occasions. Then they toured the United States and Canada for over 20 years. They were hugely successful. They came up with this incredible way of touring where they would tour for up to 47 weeks straight, performing nearly every night. And then they would take a few weeks off and do the same thing, performing all over the US and Canada. And as they toured, they sold songbooks, and there were a few different versions of them. They looked like this. Some of them still survive till today. They had color front and back covers. You can see on the cover of this, there's 4 men dressed in formal attire. Here's another version of the book. Here's the front cover. The back cover reminds us of the context where African American spirituals were born and came from. Here's another version of the book, and when you open these books up, you can see it indicates that it's, they say that they did a 5-year tour of Great Britain, 20 years tour of the United States, and they had music and lyrics for different spirituals that they performed. Here's music that they used for Swing Low, Sweet Chariot. Here's a bunch of concert programs. These concert programs are probably at least 100 years old, and they still exist today, so we can actually see some of the members and some of the songs that they performed. Hugely important and popular group for several decades. Here's another figure I want to talk about, Hattie Rue Hatchett. She lived most of her life in Buxton, which I mentioned earlier. That was a rural but very successful early black settlement just outside of Chatham. And she worked tirelessly to make all kinds of music in her community as a singer, pianist, organist, songwriter, choir director, and music teacher. And what's so amazing about her is her music traveled well outside the borders of Buxton. She wrote a song called That Sacred Spot. Here's sheet music for it. This was published in 1913, and this song became the official marching hymn of the Canadian Army during World War I. It's pretty amazing that a woman living in a rural community, black woman 100 years ago, writes a song, and it becomes the official marching hymn of the Canadian Army during World War I. This song would have been heard probably all over the world, and we know actually that it was performed decades later at Remembrance Day type events in the Chatham area. Another song she wrote was Jesus Tender Shepherd Lead Us. This is the sheet music. It was written in 1916, and it's her most beloved song. She sold thousands of copies of sheet music for this song, and it spread throughout North America and possibly overseas because there were many people who were born and raised in Buxton, but then they moved away in search of work, and they ended up moving all over Canada, the US, and they took this song with them. We also know that this song was played on radio stations in the Chatham area, and it was still being performed at Buxton community events as recently as the 1990s. This was decades after Hattie Rue Hatchett died. She died in 1958 at the age of 94. But still in the 90s, her music, the impact of her music was felt in her community. Here's another incredible black Canadian woman, Marion Crowley Newby. She made music literally her whole life. She was a classically trained pianist and singer, and she was born into a musical family, raised actually here in Toronto. And she started singing in her church choir when she was 2 years old. And then she gave her last solo performance 3 weeks before she passed away from cancer in 1991. And in between that, she toured and performed at churches and concert halls in Canada and the United States. Her singing voice was heard and broadcast by radio stations in Toronto and Chicago in the 40s and 50s. She worked as a music teacher at several schools, and she released the album Here in 1967. And I'll just play a little bit for you. This song is her rendition of Precious Lord, Take My Hand, and that, by the way, is one of the most popular songs in the black gospel community. Let me play it.
Precious Lord, take my hand,
Now I'm going to skip ahead a little bit here to contemporary gospel music in Ontario. In 1969, Canada began using a points-based immigration system that made it easier for people from Caribbean islands to immigrate here. And so starting in the early 1970s, we began to see waves of Caribbean immigrants coming to Canada. Many came from Jamaica, but other islands too, Barbados, Trinidad, and many others. And many settled in Toronto. Some joined churches and formed gospel groups, and these are two examples of groups who released albums, the Harvelites and the Revival Heirs. Here's the most popular song by the Revival Heirs.
Now they wasn't worthy, oh Lord, this I know. I heard him say, Jesus, do you believe it? I know that Jesus saved your life. Well, truly my way, I have to move sometime. Lord, truly my way, I got to move sometime. I lie awake at night. Lord, look, that's so right. Lord, I knew I heard somebody say, Jesus, He will fix. Do you believe He will?
Now we're going to move on to the 1990s, which saw a rise in popularity of gospel choirs. And one gospel choir in Ontario was called the Youth Outreach Mass Choir. This is their album Just Look that was released in 1996, and it was nominated for a Juno Award. This is a great example of a group that started in the church, but soon became highly visible by performing at places like the Toronto Jazz Festival. And then they performed on CBC television with Rita McNeil, and very quickly they became sort of the go-to gospel choir that major acts would hire to sing backup when they came to Toronto. So they ended up singing backup for everyone from Celine Dion, Michael Bolton, Puff Daddy, Susan Aglukark, Michelle Wright. He sang with lots of really prominent people. And here's another choir, Sharon Riley and Faith Corral. There was a woman named Londa Larmond who sang in that choir and ended up pursuing a solo career. And these two artists were signed to EMI in the US in the late 90s. This is really significant. Gospel groups from Ontario being signed to a major record label. So because of that, they were able to work with some top American gospel artists. And Sharon Riley and Faith Corral actually ended up performing on the movie Blues Brothers 2000, and they performed at the Grammy Awards around that same time. And they've also performed with several famous artists at Toronto shows, ranging from Kanye West, Mariah Carey, and Josh Groban. The last group I'm going to talk about today is the Toronto Mass Choir, pictured here. They were formed in 1988, and they're still active to this day. They've released 9 albums. One of them is a Juno Award-winning album. They've performed across Canada and the United States, and they've performed overseas in Barbados, Trinidad, Hungary, Romania, England, Italy, and Poland. And so their music has really gone well outside of Ontario borders. There's been many thousands of people who have heard them live and recorded, and I'll just play a short video clip of them performing. So I think that it's clear by now that Black gospel music and the Black church in Ontario has had a huge impact here at home and beyond. And you know, when I think about the Black church in Ontario, I'm reminded of why it's so important to celebrate Black History Month. We need to acknowledge these cultural contributions to Canada, and we also need to learn from the past. And I think what we can take from this today is a great model of a community that the Black church provides us. The Black church welcomed with open arms and with loving arms newly arrived immigrants, and welcomed them with love and made them feel welcome in their new home. And I think that that kind of close-knit, loving community that would embrace others and was inclusive, that is something that we all need to work on modeling today. And I think that that is something that Centennial College strives to do. It's a community, we're a community here, of course. It's a community that I've been very grateful to be a part of. Look forward to continuing to be part of it. And it's a good reminder to us all to be loving and embracing of diversity and inclusive. And so thank you very much for being here again, for listening, and I will turn it back over to you.
Thank you so very much. Ladies and gentlemen, are there any questions to Jesse?
We can talk after.
Of course. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, certainly, Dr. Jesse, thank you so much. I certainly have a better appreciation now for the cultural representation as a relatively new person coming into this country as well. I am thoroughly grateful for the work that you have put in to document this. Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to remind you that this is, in fact, the first of the series that we have here at Centennial College. And there are posters around the campus that speaks to the others that we have set up. But on Friday, we're going to have, and so I'll just remind you, sorry, on Monday, same place, same time here in the foyer, we will be treated to a special dance performance on as our students seek to honor Black History Month, of course. So the next one will be a presentation through dance, and then on Friday we'll have a first of a two-part series, Still I Rise, which explores the Black struggle through music. Thank you so much for coming, and of course, thanks those who are also watching and listening online for joining us today. Do have a good rest of the day. Good evening.